Ah, welcome. Warm yourself by the fire. Have a seat or snuggle up in your favorite spot and let me tell you a story. Penniless and proud he was, and that pair don't draw a man to pleasant places when they've been in double harness. There's only one thing can stop 'em if they take the bit between their teeth, and that's a woman. So, there you might say, lies the text of the tale of Jonathan Drake of Dunnabridge Farm, a tenement in the forest of Dartmoor. Naboth's vineyard and duchy wanted it, and the greedy thing would have given a very fair price for it, without a doubt. But the Drake folk held their land, and wouldn't part with it, and boasted a freehold of 50 acres in the very midst of the forest. They did well, too, and moved with the times, and kept their heads high for more generations than I can call home. And they come to what all families, whether gentle or simple, always come to sooner or later. And that's a black sheep. Bad uns there'll be in every generation of a race. But the trouble begins when a bad un changes up to be top, and if the head of the family is a drunkard or a spendthrift, or built on too free and flowing a pattern for this workaday shop, well, then the next generation may look out for squalls, as the sailormen say. 'Twas Jonathan's grandfather that did the harm at Dunnabridge. He had sport in his blood on his mother's side, and 'twas horses that ran him into trouble. He backed 'em and was ruined, and then his son bred 'em and didn't do much better. So when the pair of 'em dropped out of the hunt and died with their backs to the wall, one after the other, it looked as if the game was up for them to follow. By good chance, however, Tom Drake had but one child, a boy, the Jonathan, as I've been telling you about. And when his father and grandfather passed away, within a year of each other, Dunnabridge was left to Tom's widow and her son, him then being 22. She was for selling Dunnabridge and getting away from Dartmoor, because the place had used her bad, and she hated the sight of it. But Jonathan, a proud chap even then, got the lawyers to look into the matter, and they told him that it wasn't vital for Dunnabridge to be sold, though it might ease his pocket, and smooth his futures to do so, especially as the duchy wanted the place rather bad, and had offered the value of it. And Jonathan's mother was on the side of the duchy too, and went to her knees to Jonathan to sell, but he wouldn't. He had a bee in his bonnet sometimes, and said that all the Drakes would rise up out of their graves in Widcombe churchyard and hunt him down if he were to do such a thing, just to be rid of the place. So he made a plan with the creditors. It figured out that his father and grandfather had owed near £1,000 between them, and then Jonathan actually set himself to pay it off to the last penny. 'Twas the labor of years. By the time he was 33, he had done it. At what cost of scrimping and saving, only his mother might have told. She never did tell, however, for she died 2 years before the last item was paid. Some went as far as to declare that, well, it was her son's miserly ways that hurried her into her grave. And for all I know, they may have done so, for it is certain in her husband's life she had a better time. Tom was the large-hearted, juicy, easy sort, as liked meat on the table and plenty to wash it down, and he loved Mercy Jane Drake very well. And when he died, the only thought that troubled him was leaving her, and the last thing he advised his son to do was to sell Dunnabridge and take his mother off the moor down to the in-country where she'd come from. But Jonathan, well, he was made of different stuff, and 'twas rumored by old people that had known the family for several generations that he favored an ancient forefather by the name of Brimpson Drake. This bygone man was a miser and the richest of the race. He lived in the days when we were at war with France and America, and when Princeton sprang up, a war prison was built there to cage all the chaps we got on our hands through winning such a lot of sea battles. Miser Brimpson was said to have made thousands by helping rich fellows to escape from the prison. Truth and falsehood mixed made up his story as 'twas handed down. But one thing appeared to be fairly true about it, which was that when the miser died and Dunnabridge went to his cousin, the horse racer, not a penny of his fortune ever came into the sight of the living men. So some said 'twas all nonsense, and he never had no money at all, but only pretended to. And others again declared that he knew too well who'd follow in his shoes at Dunnabridge, and hid his money accordingly, so that no Drake should have it, for he hated his heirs, only as a miser can hate them. So things stood when Mercy Jane died, and Jonathan was left alone. He paid all his relations' debts, and he had his trouble and the honor of being honorable for his pains. Everybody respected him something wonderful, but all the same, a few of his mother's friends always did say that 'twas a pity he put his dead father's good name before his living mother's life. However, we're not built in the pattern of our fellow creatures, and 'tis only fools that waste time blaming a man for being himself. Jonathan went his stern way, and then, in the lonely days after his parents were taken, when he lived at Dunnabridge, with naught but 2 farm hands and a brace of sheepdogs, 'twas suddenly borne in upon his narrow sight that, well, there might be other women still in the world. And he also discovered, doubtless, that a home without a woman therein be merely the cruel mockery of what a home should be. A good few folk watched Jonathan to see what he'd done about it, and no doubt a maiden here and there was interested too, because though a terribly poor man, he wasn't bad to look at, though rather hard about the edge of the jaw, and rather short and stern in his manners to human creatures and beasts alike. And then began his funny courting, if you can call it courting, where a poor man allows himself the luxury of pride at the wrong time and makes a show of himself in consequence. Well, at least that's my view. But you must know that a good few, quite as wise as me, took to the other side, and held that Jonathan covered his name with glory when he changed his mind about Hyssop Burgess. That was her bitter name, but a pleasanter girl never walked on shoe leather. She was Farmer Stonewar's niece to Whiteworks, and he took her in for charity, and always said that it was the best day's work he'd ever done. A straight, hard-working, cheerful sort of a girl, with nothing to name about her very special save a fine shape and a proud way of holding her head in the air and looking her fellow creatures in the eyes. Proud she was, for certain, and terrible particular as to her friends. But there happened to be that about Jonathan that made him flint to her steel. He knowed she was penniless, or he'd have not looked at her twice, and when after a short, fierce sort of courting, she took him. And everybody felt pleased about it but Farmer Stonewar, who couldn't abide the thought of losing Hyssop, though his wife had warned him many times of this for 4 years, that, well, 'twas bound to happen. Farmer and the girl were sitting waiting for Jonathan one night, and she was a bit nervous, and he was trying for to calm her. "Jonathan must be told," she said. "It can go on no longer." "Well, then tell him," said her uncle. "To see you in this state, one would think the news was the worst as could ever fall between a poor pair of lovers instead of the best." "Oh, I know him a lot better than you do," she told Farmer. "And I know how difficult he can be when money is the matter. He very nearly throwed me over when, in a weak moment, I asked him to buy me my own token ring. Red as a turkey's waddle did he flame, and he said I'd insulted him. And now, when he hears the secret, I can't for the life of me guess how he'll take it." "Well, 'twas a pity you didn't tell him when he offered for you," declared Hyssop's aunt. "Proud he is, as silly as a peacock, and terrible frightened of seeming to look after money, or even casting his eyes where it bides. But he came to you without any notion of the windfall, and he loved you for yourself, like an honest man. And you loved him the same way, and, well, you know he didn't want you for your money, whether 5,000 or 500 pounds your cousin left you. You knew Jonathan Drake was the right chap for you. He can't blame himself, for not a soul on Dartmoor but us three has ever heard tell about the money." "But he'll blame me for having all that money," answered the girl. "He said a dozen times before he offered for me that he'd never look at a woman if she got more cash than what he had. And that's why I couldn't bring myself to confess it and lose him. And after we was tokened, it got to be harder still." "Why not bide till you're married, then?" asked Mrs. Stonewer. "Since it has gone so long, let it go longer and surprise him with the news on the wedding night." "No," answered the farmer. "Enough is as good as a feast. 'Tis squandering blessings to do that at such a time. Keep the news till some rainy day, when he's wondering how to get around a tight corner. That's the moment to tell him, and that's the moment he's least likely to make a face at the news." But Hyssop wouldn't put it off no more. She said she'd not have any further peace till the matter was out. And that very night, sure enough, when Jonathan came over from Dunnabridge for his bit of visiting, and the young couple had got the farm parlor to themselves, she plumbed it out, finding him in a very kindly mood. They never cuddled much, for he wasn't built that way, but he'd not disdain to sit beside her and put his arm around her now and again when she picked up his hand and drew it around. Then off and on, she'd rub her cheek against his mutton-chopped whiskers, till he had to kiss her in common politeness. Well, Hyssop got it out, Lord only knows how, as she said afterwards. She got it out and told him that an old-aged cousin had died and left her a nice little pile of money, and how she'd never touched a penny but let it build in the bank, and how she prayed and hoped 'twould help them at Dunnabridge, and how, of course, he must have the handling of it, being a man and so cruel and clever in such things. Well, she went on and on, pretty well frightened to stop and hear him. But after she'd said it over about a dozen times, her breath failed her, and she shut her mouth and tried to smile, and looked up terribly anxious and pleading at Jonathan. His hard gray eyes bored into hers like a brace of gimlets, and in return for all her talk, he asked but one question. "How long have you had this here money?" he said. She told the truth, faltering and shaking under his glare. "Over 4 years, Jonathan." That's years and years before I asked you to marry me." "Yes, Jonathan." "And you remember what I said about never marrying anybody that had more than I had?" "Yes, Jonathan." "And you full know well how many times I told you that. After I paid off all my father's debt, I had nothing left, and it would be years before I could build up anything to call money." "Yes, Jonathan." "Very well, then," he cried out, and his brow crooked down and his fists clenched. "Very well. You have deceived me deliberately, and if you do that in one thing, you would in another. I'm going out of this house this instant moment, and you can tell your relations why it is. I'm terribly sorry, Hyssop Burgess, for no man will ever love you better than what I did. And so you'd live to find out when all this here courting tomfoolery is over, and you'd come to be my wife. But now, I'll have none of you, for you've played with me. You've lied to me. And so I'll bid you goodbye." He went straight out, without one more speech, one more word, and she tottered, weeping, to her uncle and aunt. They couldn't believe their senses, and Jimmy Stoneward declared thereupon that any man who could make himself such a masterpiece of a fool as Jonathan had done that night was better out of the marriage than in it. Her uncle told Hyssop she'd have a marvelous escape from a loony man, and his wife said the same. But the girl couldn't see it like that. She'd known Jonathan weren't loony, and his raging pride didn't anger her, for she admired it something wonderful, and it only made her feel her loss all the crueler to see what a terribly rare, haughty sort of a chap he was. There were a lot of other men who would have had her, and twice as many again if they'd known about the money, but they all seemed as tame as robins beside her hawk of a Jonathan. She had plenty of devil in her, too, when it came to the fighting for something. And now, while he merely said the match was broken off through a difference of opinion and gave no reason for it, she set to work with all her might to get him back again, and used her love-sharped wit so well as she knew how to best him into matrimony. In truth, she made poor speed. Jonathan was always civil afterwards, but you might as soon have tried to thaw an iceberg with a box of matches as to get him around again by gentleness and affection. He was the sort that couldn't be won with kindness. He felt he'd treated the world better than the world had treated him, and the thought shriveled his heart a bit. Always shy and suspicious, you might say, and yet underneath it, the most honorable and upright and high-minded man you could wish to meet. Hyssop loved him like her life, and she got a bit poorly in health after their sad quarrel. Then chance willed it that, going down from Princeton to Plymouth by train to see a chemist and get something to make her eat, who should be in the selfsame carriage but Mr. Drake and his farmhand, Thomas Parsons. There was others there, too, and it fell out that an old fellow as knowed Jonathan's grandfather before him brought up the yarn about miser Brimpson and asked young Drake if he took any stock of it. Of course, the man pooh-poohed such foolery, and told the old chap not to talk such nonsense like that. But when Jonathan and Parsons had got off the train, which they did at Yelverton Station, Hyssop, as she knew the old man, asked him to tell more about the miser, and he explained so well as he knew how that Brimpson Drake had made untold thousands out of the French and American prisoners, that, without a doubt, 'twas all hidden even to this day at Dunnabridge. Of course, Jonathan's too clever to believe such a tale, like his father before him, but his grandfather believed it, and the old man spent half of his time poking around the farm. Only, unfortunately, he didn't have no luck. But it's there for sure, and if Jonathan had enough faith, he'd come by it, not by digging and wasting time and labor, but by doing what is right and proper when you're dealing with such matters. "And what might that be?" asked Miss Burgess. Just then, however, the train for Plymouth ran up, and the old man told her that he'd explain some other time. This generation laughs at such things," he said. "But they laugh best who laugh last, and, for all we can say to the contrary, 'tis not but his conceit and pride be standing between that stiff-necked youth and the wealth of a bank." Hyssop, well, she thought a lot upon this, but she had no need to go to the old chap again as she had meant to before, for when she got home, her uncle, Farmer Stonewar, knowed all about the matter, and told her how 'twas a very rooted opinion among the last generation that a miser's spirit never could leave its hidden hoard till the stuff was brought to light and in human hands once more. Millions of good money has been found in that manner, if it's all that we hear is true, declared Farmer Jimmy. And if one miser has been known to walk, which nobody can deny, then why shouldn't another? Them as believe in such dark things, and I don't say I do. I don't say that I don't, but them as know of such mysteries happening in their own recollection or in the memory of their friends, would doubtless say that Miser Brimpson still creeps around his gold now and again. And if that money be within the four corners of Dunnabridge Farm, and if Jonathan happened to be on the lookout on the rightful night and at the rightful moment, 'tis almost any odds, but he might see his forebear sitting over his money bags like a hen on a clutch of eggs, and so recover the hoard. But faith's needed for such a deed, Miss Stoneword told her niece. And that pig-headed creature haven't got no faith. Too proud he is to believe in anything he don't understand. 'Twas even so with Lucifer afore him. If you told him, Jonathan that is, this news, he'd rather let the money go than set off ghost hunting in cold blood. Yet there it is, and a humble-minded fashion of chap, with the Lord on his side and a trustful heart in his bosom, might very likely recover all them tubs of cash the miser came by. And then he'd have thousands to my poor tens, said Hyssop. Not that he'd ever come back to me now, I reckon. But all the same, she knowed by the look in Jonathan's eyes when they met that he loved her still, and that his silly proud heart was hungering for her yet, though he'd rather have been drawn under a harrow than show a spark of what was burning there. And so, upon this nonsense about a buried treasure, she set to work again to use her brains and see if there might be any road out of the trouble by way of Miser Brimpson's ghost. What she did, none but them as helped with her ever knew, until the story come around to me. But 'twas the cleverest thing that I ever heard of a maiden doing, and it worked a wonder. In fact, I can't see but a single objection to the plot, though that was a serious thing for the girl. It lay in the fact that there had been a secret between Hyssop and her husband, and she kept it close as the grave until the grave itself closed over him. Yet 'twas an innocent secret, and when all's said and done, there ain't a wedded pair in 500 that don't have their own secrets locked away. 6 months passed by, and Jonathan worked as only he knowed how to work, and tried to forget his sad disappointment by dint of toil. Early and late he labored, and got permission to reclaim a bit of moor for a new take, and so added a very fair 3 acres to his farm. He noticed about this time that his hand, Parsons, did often drag up the subject of Mr. Brimpson Drake. At first, Jonathan laughed, and then he was angered, and bade Thomas hold his peace. But though a very obedient and humble sort of man, Parsons would hark back to the subject, and tell how his father had known a man who was his own brother to a miser, and how, when the miser died, his own brother had seen him clear as truth in the corner of his room 3 nights after they'd buried him, and how they made search and found not 3 feet from where the ghost had stood, a place in the wall with 17 golden sovereigns hid inside, and a white witch's cure for glanders. Thomas Parsons swore on the book to this, and he said, as a certain fact, that New Year's night was the time most misers walked, and he advised Jonathan not to be dead to his own interests. Well, at least as a thinking man that believes in religion and the powers of the air, in Bible word, you might give it a chance, said Thomas. And then Jonathan told him to shut his mouth and not shame Dunnabridge by talking such childish nonsense. Well, the next autumn, Jonathan went up beyond Exeter to buy some of them black-faced horned Scotch sheep, and he wanted for Parsons to go with him. But his man fell ill the night before, and so young Hacker went instead. Drake reckoned that Thomas Parsons would leave, for Dunnabridge weren't no place for sick folk, and he'd made up his mind after he came back to turn the old chap off. But Thomas was better when the master got home, so the question of sacking him was let be, and Jonathan contested himself by telling Thomas that if he fell ill again, it would be the last time. Parsons said that this is the way that it should be, but he hoped that at his age, merely 65 or thereabout, he wouldn't be troubled with his breathing parts again for 10 years at least. He added that he'd done his work as usual while the master was away, but he didn't mention that Hyssop Burgess had made so bold as to call at Dunnabridge with the pony and cart, and that she'd spent a tidy long time there, and gone all over the house and farmyard among other places, before she drove off again. The next chapter of the story was told by Jonathan himself to his 2 men on the first day of the following year. There was but little light of morning just then, and the 3 of them were putting down some bread and bacon and a quart of tea by candlelight in the Dunnabridge kitchen, when Thomas saw that his master weren't eating nothing. Instead, he went out to the barrel and drawed himself up a pint of ale, and got along to the peat fire with it, and stuck his boot as near the flame as he dared without burning them. "What's amiss?" said Thomas. "Don't say you're sick, master, and if you be, I lay no liquor smaller than brandy will fetch you around." "Not sick," answered Jonathan shortly. He seemed in doubt as to whether to go on. Then he resolved to do so. "Well, there was a man in the yard last night," he said, "and if I thought as either of you chaps knowed anything about it, I'd turn you off this instant, before you got that bacon out of your throats." "A man? Couldn't be," cried Parsons. "Well, how was it the dog didn't bark?" asked Hacker. "Well, how the devil do I know why he didn't bark?" answered Jonathan, dark as night and staring into the fire. On one side of his face was red with flames, on the other blue as steel from the daylight just beginning to filter in the window. "All I can say is this," he added. "I turned in half after 10, just after that brace of old fools to Brownberry went off to see the New Year's in. I slept till midnight, and then something woke me with a start. What it was, I can't tell, but 'twas some loud sound near at hand, no doubt. I was going off again when I heard more of a row, a steady sound repeated over and over. And first I thought it was owls. Then I heard it wasn't. You might have said it was somebody thumping on a barrel. But at any rate, I woke up and sat up and found the noise was in the yard. I looked out of my chamber window then, and the moon was bright as day, and the stars sparkling likewise. And there, down by the judge's table, where the thorn tree grows, I seen a man standing by the old barrel as plain as I see you chaps now." The judge's table is a wonderful curiosity at Dunnabridge, and if you go there, you'll do well to ask to see it. 'Tis a great slab of moorstone, said to have come from Crocker and Tor, where the tinners held their parliament in the ancient times. Now it bides over a water trough with a white thorn tree rising above it. Jonathan took his breath when he got that far, and fetched his pipe out of his pocket and lighted it. Then he drank off half the beer and spat into the fire, and then went on. A man so tall as me, if not taller. He'd got one of them old white beaver hats on his head, and he wore a flowing white beard so long as my plow horse's tail. And he walked up and down over the stones, like a sailor walks up and down the deck of a ship. And I shouted to the chap, but he'd taken no more notice than the moon. Up and down he went, and then I told him if he wasn't off inside of 2 minutes, I'd get my shotgun and let fly. Still, he paid no heed, and I don't mind saying to you men that for half a second I felt creepy, cold, and goose-fleshed down the back. But 'twas only the cold, I reckon, for my window was wide open, and I'd been leaning out of it for a good while into a 10-degree frost. Well, after that, I got angry, and went down to the house and hitched the gun off the hook over the mantelpiece and ran out just as I was, in nothing but my boots and nightshirt. The hour was so still as the grave at first, and the moon shone on the river far below and lit up the eaves and windows. And then, through the silence, I heard Whitcomb bells ringing in the new year. But the old night bird in his top hat was gone. Not a hair of his beard did he leave behind. Well, I looked about, and then came up the dog, barking like fury, not knowing who I was, dressed that way, till he heard my voice. Well, and that's the tale. And who be that curious old rascal? I'd much like to know. Well, they didn't answer at first, and the daylight gained on them. Then old Parson spoke up, and wagged his head and swore that 'twas no man his master had seen, but a creature from the other world. I'll lay my life, he said, 'twas the spectre of Miser Brimpson you saw walking, and I'll take an oath by the New Year's that 'twas his way to show where his stuff had been buried. For God's sake, he said, if you don't want to get into trouble with unknown creatures, go out and pull up the cobblestones and see if there's anything underneath them. But Jonathan made as though the whole thing was nonsense, and wouldn't let neither Thomas nor Hacker move a pebble. Only the next day, he went off to a very old chap called Samuel Windet, whose father had been a boy at the time of the war prison, and was said to have seen and known Miser Brimpson in the flesh. And the old man declared that in his childish days he'd have heard of the miser, and that he certainly wore a beaver hat and had a white beard a yard long. So Jonathan came home again more thoughtful than before, and finally, though he declared that he was ashamed to do it, he let Tom over-persuade him, and 2 days after the 3 men set to work where Drake had seen the spectre. They dug and they dug, this way and that. Jonathan found nothing, and Parsons found nothing. But Hacker, he came upon a box, and they dragged it out of the earth, and underneath it was another box like the first. There was a pair of old rotten wooden chests, by the look of them, made of boards nailed together with rusty nails. No locks or keys had they, but that was no matter, for they fell apart at the touch, and inside of them was a stash of candlesticks, snuffers, tea kettles, table silver, and the like. "Thunder!" cried Jonathan. "It's all pewter trash. Not worth a 5-pound note. We'll dig again." And dig they did, for a week, till the farmyard in the place was turned over like a trenched kitchen garden. But not another teaspoon did they find. Meantime, however, somebody as understood such things explained to young Drake that the stuff unearthed was not pewter, nor yet Britannia metal neither, but old Sheffield plate, and worth plenty of good money at that. Well, Jonathan felt too amazed with the event to do anything about it for a month. Then he went to Plymouth and took a few pieces of the finds in his bag, and the man what he showed them to was so terribly interested that he must come to Dunnabridge and see the lot himself. He offered £250 for the things right then and there. So, Jonathan saw very clear that they must be worth a good bit more. Well, they haggled for a week, and finally the owner went up to Exeter and got another chap to name a price. In the long run, the dealers split the things, and Jonathan came out with a clear £354. He wasn't very pleased to talk about his luck, and inquisitive people got but little out of him on the subject. But of course, Parsons and Hacker spoke free and often on the subject, for 'twas the greatest adventure as had ever come between them in their lives. And from telling the tale over and over, old Parsons got to talk about it as if he'd seen the ghost himself. Then after he'd chewed over the matter for a space of 3 or 4 months, and spring was coming again, Jonathan Drake went off one night to White Works, just the same as he used to do when he was courting Hyssop Burgess. And there was the little party as usual, with Mrs. Stonewer knitting, and Farmer reading yesterday's paper, and Hyssop sewing in her place by her aunt. "Well," says Farmer Jimmy, "wonders never cease, and to see you again here to be almost so big a wonder as they tell about that of the old miser's tea things. I'm sure we all give you joy, Jonathan, and I needn't tell you as we were very pleased to hear about it." The young man thanked them very civilly, and said how it was a curious thing to find the treasure, and he didn't hardly know what to think of the matter even to that day. "I should reckon it was a bit of nonsense, what I dreamed," he said. "But money is money, as who should know better than me? And by the same token, I want a few words with Hyssop if she's willing to give me 10 minutes of her time." "You're welcome to, Mr. Drake," Hyssop said. He started to say something at her using his surname, but she got up and they went off just in the usual way to the parlor. And when they was there, she sat down in her old corner of the horsehair sofa and looked at him. But he didn't sit down, not at first. He walked about fierce and talked fierce. "I'll ask one question before I go on, and if the answer's what I fear, I'll trouble you no more," he said. "In a word, be you spoken for again? Well, I suppose you're not the sort to go begging. Say it quick, if it's so, and I'll be off and trouble you no further." "No, Mr. Drake, I'm free as the day you turned me away," she answered, in a very quiet little voice. Well, he snorted at that, but was too mighty thankful to quarrel with the words. She could see he began to grow terribly excited now. And then he walked up and down, taking shorter and shorter strides this way and that way, and like a hungry caged tiger might. At last, he burst out again. "There's a lot of lies told about that cash we found at Dunnabridge, but the truth of the matter is that I sold it for £354. Yes, Tom Parsons told my uncle. A wonderful thing. And we sat up all night talking about it, Mr. Drake. For God's sake, call me Jonathan," he cried out. "And tell me what that figure of your inheritance was. You have to tell me. You can't withhold it. It's life or death to me." She'd never seen him so excited, but very well knowed what was in his mind. "If you must know, then you must," she answered. "I thought I told you when—" No, you didn't. I wouldn't I'd hear it. Whatever it was, you'd gotten more than me, and that was all I cared about. But now, if by good fortune it's less than mine, well, you understand. Of course it's less. £180 and the interest. A little over 200 in all. That's what I've inherited. Oh, thank God, he said. Then he asked her if she could marry him still, or if she knew too much about his ways and his ideas to care about doing so. And she took him again. You see, Hyssop Burgess was my mother, and when Father died, I had the rights of the story from her. By that time, the old people at White Works and Tom Parsons were all gone, and the secret remained safe enough with Hyssop herself. The great difficulty was to put half her money and more into Jonathan's hand without his knowing how it got there. And even more when the game with the ghost was hit upon. It was hard to know how to do it cleverly. Hyssop wanted to hide golden sovereigns at Dunnabridge, but her uncle, with wonderful wit, pointed out that they'd all be dated, and to get 300 sovereigns more than 100 years old, well, that could never have been managed. Then old Thomas, who was in the secret, of course, had played the part of Miser Brimpson and had got £5 for doing it so clever, and another £5 from his master when the stuff was found. And finally, Mrs. Stonewer, as had a friend in the business, said that Sheffield plate would do the trick. And she was right. The plate was bought for £380 and kept close at White Works till it was known that Jonathan meant to go away for some days. Then my mother drove across with it to Dunnabridge, and Thomas made the case with old rotten boards, and they dug a slant hole under the cobbles long before Drake came back home. Me and Jonathan was wedded in the fall of that year, said my mother to me when she told the tale. And come the next New Year's night, he was at our chamber window as the clock struck 12, and bided there, looking out into the yard for an hour, keen as the hawk that he was. He thought I must be asleep, but, well, I knew he was looking for an old man in a beaver hat, with a long white beard, and, well, I knew he'd never see him again. Of course, your father took good care not to tell me the next morning that he'd been on the lookout for the ghost. And my mother, in her own last days, often dwelt on that trick, and sometimes she'd say as the time for meeting Father got nearer and nearer, I wonder if it will make any difference in heaven where no secrets are kept. And knowing Father so well as I had, I felt very sure as it might make a lot of difference. So, in my crafty way, I hedged and told Mother that, for my part, I felt certain there were some secrets that wouldn't be even allowed to come out on Judgment Day, for fear of turning heaven into the other place, and, well, that was one of them. She always used to fret at that, however. I want for it to come out, she'd say. And if Jonathan don't know, I shall certainly tell him. I've kept it in long enough, and I can't trust myself to do it no more. He's got to know, and with all eternity to get over it and to forgive me, and I have a right to be hopeful that he will. Hyssop Drake died in that fixed resolve, and I'm sure, well, I trust that when it's my turn to join my parents again, I shall find no shadow between them. But there's a lot of doubt about that. Knowing Father. If you like these stories, subscribe, like, and share. And don't forget to hit that notification bell for future stories. And as always, I thank you for taking the time to listen. The end.